People often mistake politeness for peace. They are not, and have never been, the same thing. The late autumn evening had settled over Manhattan, bringing a silver fog that pressed against the panoramic glass of the penthouse bedroom. Inside, the temperature was perfectly regulated, yet the sprawling space felt undeniably cold. I stood before the full-length mirror, my fingers moving with quiet precision as I fastened the unadorned pearl buttons of my dress. The gown was a deep, muted navy, tailored with clean lines reflecting my roots in the maritime city of Genoa. Substance always outweighed spectacle. There was no sudden warning before the mahogany door swung open. Bianca Moretti stepped into the room, her heels striking the polished marble floor like a metronome, ticking out a warning. My sister-in-law was armored in layers of structured ivory silk and diamonds that caught the harsh overhead light, her reflection appearing in the glass beside me. "You are wearing that?" Bianca's voice was smooth, carrying the sharp cadence of a woman who had never been told no. Her gaze swept over the simple fabric with open disdain. "It is a charity gala, not a funeral in the old country. Marco is going to be photographed with the board members tonight. The least you could do is attempt to look like you belong in this family, rather than someone we hired to manage the coat check." I did not flinch. My hands remained perfectly steady as I smoothed the fabric over my wrists, looking at the other woman through the mirror. The air felt heavy, suffocating under the weight of an inherited arrogance that Bianca wore like a second skin. As Bianca shifted her weight, my eyes caught a minor, almost invisible imperfection. Near the hem of the custom-fitted designer gown, a long, loose thread of ivory silk had begun to unravel. It dragged slightly against the cold glass, a tiny structural flaw in a seemingly flawless presentation. It would have been a small, sharp victory to point it out, to watch her panic over a wardrobe malfunction. But I chose not to speak. My silence was not submission. It was a deliberate protective boundary. I did not owe this woman my observation. "I am ready," I said softly. My tone was completely composed, betraying nothing of the vast, quiet distance that had already begun to form between me and the empire I had married into. The art gallery in Chelsea was a cavernous space of exposed white brick and abstract canvases. It was designed to be loud, the acoustics amplifying the overlapping chatter of New York's corporate elite and the clinking of crystal glasses. I stood near the edge of an illuminated pillar, holding a narrow flute of champagne. I had no intention of drinking. The glass was beaded with cold condensation. Across the room, Marco Moretti was holding court. My husband looked immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit, his posture relaxed, his smile weaponized to charm potential investors. He was a man entirely in his element, yet standing less than 20 feet away from him, I felt invisible. To his left stood Bianca, surrounded by a tight circle of influential socialites, including Clara Vance. Clara was a woman whose wealth was matched only by her capacity for casual cruelty. The noise of the gallery ebbed slightly as the string quartet paused. In that brief silence, my sister-in-law's voice carried across the polished concrete floor, sharp and theatrical. "It's just impossible to have a strategic conversation with her," Bianca was saying, dripping with mock sympathy. I tried to explain the logistics for the Palermo route. She tried to say freight tariffs. She exaggerated a clumsy, cartoonish Italian accent, twisting the words until they sounded primitive. Freighta tarifa. It's like trying to explain international commerce to a peasant from a fishing village. I don't know how Marco endures the embarrassment. Clara Vance laughed softly, a polite, devastating sound. I remained perfectly still. The ambient noise faded out, leaving only the ringing echo of the mockery. I did not let my shoulders drop. Instead, I looked directly at Marco. My husband had heard it. For one breathless second, I waited for the powerful man who commanded fleets of cargo ships to silence his sister. Instead, Marco adjusted his cufflinks, glancing nervously at the surrounding investors. He offered a slight, accommodating chuckle to diffuse the tension, choosing the comfort of his social circle over the dignity of his marriage. A moment later, he drifted over to where I stood. He did not look me in the eye, just, "Keep your conversations brief tonight, all right?" Marco murmured, his voice low. "Let's not confuse anyone with the language barrier." He patted my arm, a dismissive gesture, and turned back to his audience. I looked down at the fragile champagne flute. The glass felt as though it might shatter under the slightest pressure. I slowly lifted my gaze, locking eyes with Bianca across the room. The other woman's smile was triumphant. Tears would have been a predictable reaction. An argument would have been a desperate negotiation. Absolute stillness simply meant a final decision had been reached. Moving with exact, deliberate care, I lowered the crystal glass to the surface of a marble table. I set it down so gently that the base made absolutely no sound against the stone. It was a microscopic action, unnoticed by the room, but within that absolute silence, a profound structural shift occurred. The invisible labor of my loyalty had just been permanently withdrawn. Some endings do not announce themselves with shattered glass or raised voices. They begin quietly, taking root in the absolute silence of a realization. The drive back to our Manhattan estate was steeped in a heavy stillness. Rain dragged slow silver streaks down the tinted windows of the town car. Marco sat beside me, illuminated by the harsh glow of his phone screen. He scrolled through corporate emails, entirely untroubled by the evening's events. The scent of his cologne, cold cedar and vetiver, filled the space, a stark reminder of his polished armor. He adjusted his cufflinks, oblivious to the emotional chasm that had permanently opened between us. Inside the foyer, the vastness of the architecture felt distinctly different. The crystal chandelier cast icy light across the white marble floor. I did not follow my husband up the sweeping staircase. Instead, I drifted toward the kitchen, the soft click of my heels echoing in the empty space. I prepared a cup of chamomile tea, watching the water boil as a solitary anchor in the quiet night. I carried the porcelain cup upstairs, feeling its gentle warmth slowly fade against my palms. In the master suite, Marco had already retreated to his dressing room. The heavy door was firmly shut, and the rushing sound of the shower masked any need for him to face me. I stood alone near the center of the room, my eyes drawn to the massive mahogany desk where he managed his private correspondence. I placed the teacup on the polished surface. I did not drink it. I simply watched the thin wisp of steam vanish into the cold air. I lowered my gaze to my left hand. There, the platinum wedding band rested exactly where Marco had placed it 3 years ago. It was a remarkably simple piece of metal, free of the ostentatious diamonds his sister favored. I had chosen it because I once believed our connection required no performative embellishment. For years, I had guarded its meaning, respecting the vows it represented, even as the man who gave it to me treated my presence as a silent accessory. Taking a slow, measured breath, I reached across my fingers. The metal was warm from my own skin. I slid it over my knuckle, the motion smooth and deliberate, and lowered my hand toward the desk. The small, sharp click of the simple ring resting against the dark mahogany was the definitive sound in the room. It sat there, a tiny silver halo next to the cooling porcelain cup. I did not leave a dramatic note. Anger was loud. Sadness was loud. Calm meant something had already concluded. I stepped away from the desk, leaving the ring undisturbed, and walked toward the guest suite at the far end of the hallway. The physical silence remained unbroken, but the structural foundation of my life had shifted. The next morning, the sky over the city was the color of bruised iron. Usually, the sprawling kitchen would be filled with the rich scent of Neapolitan roast. It was an invisible sequence I had maintained since our first week in this house, measuring the imported beans, warming the ceramic cup, and leaving Marco's double espresso on the marble island just before he descended the stairs. It was a quiet act of logistical care that kept his high-pressure corporate world running smoothly without him ever needing to ask. Today, the kitchen remained perfectly dark. I did not turn on the under-cabinet lights. I did not open the vacuum-sealed jar of coffee beans. Instead, I had risen before dawn to methodically clear my presence from our shared spaces. I moved with deliberate efficiency, gathering my volumes of maritime history and the thick, handwritten notebooks I used for tracking schedules. I carried them downstairs to a secondary study, a room Marco never utilized, filled with forgotten architectural drafts and dust-sheeted furniture. I pulled the linen sheet off a modest wooden desk, positioned near the window, arranged my pens with exact precision, and set my books in a neat row. I claimed the space without asking for permission. This was no longer a shared sanctuary. It was becoming a geography of strictly drawn borders. Upstairs, the heavy thud of footsteps signaled Marco's awakening. I stood near the doorway of my new study, listening to the urgent cadence of his morning routine. His tread moved across the master suite overhead, pausing briefly, likely at the sight of the mahogany desk. Whether he noticed the ring or merely the cold cup of tea, I could not tell. Then came his descent down the stairs, his pace brisk, driven entirely by the demands of the shipping empire. He walked into the kitchen, the silence stretched, tight and brittle. From down the hall, I heard the confused scrape of a bar stool being pulled out, followed by the hesitant opening of a cabinet door. The espresso machine sat cold and silent. For a man who controlled global shipping fleets, the sudden absence of a prepared cup of coffee was a disruption of his reality. He did not know where the filters were kept or the ratio of the grind. He had never needed to learn, because my invisible labor had preempted his needs. As my silence stretched into the fifth day, the pristine architecture of Marco's empire finally cracked. I would later learn exactly how it happened. The view from the 60-floor glass walls of the Moretti shipping corporate boardroom was normally a testament to untouchable power. Today, the steel-gray water of the New York harbor below looked turbulent. Inside the climate-controlled silence, panic had taken root. Aldo Russo, the lead corporate negotiator, whose aggressive tactics had built the modern fleet, paced the length of the long marble table. His expensive leather shoes clicked sharply against the floor, each step a measure of mounting panic. He stopped, sliding a thick folder across the glass surface. Marco adjusted his platinum cufflink out of nervous habit. Sitting across from him, Bianca shifted defensively in her cashmere chair. She had drafted the final correspondence, entirely bypassing Aldo's oversight to prove her authority. It was a standard compliance demand. Bianca snapped, crossing her arms. Her voice carried the same sharp, classist arrogance that had filled the art gallery days earlier. They were stalling on the tariff restructuring. I simply applied modern corporate leverage. I told them if they didn't modernize their docking schedules, they would face breach of contract penalties. Aldo stopped pacing and pressed his hands flat against the cold glass. Donato Vizzini is not a mid-level vendor you can threaten with an audit, Bianca. He is the Sicilian patriarch. His family has controlled those waters for 3 centuries. He operates on respect, regional honor, and faith. Aldo tapped a rigid finger against the printed email. You demanded compliance. You used clinical, aggressive jargon to dictate terms to a man who expects to be spoken to as an equal. You insulted his bloodline. Marco rubbed his temples. The modern corporate machine they had built in Manhattan was entirely dependent on the ancient, unyielding maritime culture of the Mediterranean, a culture his sister clearly despised. He refuses to take my calls, Aldo added quietly. His representatives stated that they will no longer negotiate in English, nor will they speak to anyone who disrespects their harbor's history. We are stonewalled. Bianca scoffed, though the faint tremor in her hand betrayed her fear. They are being dramatic. They need our capital. No, Marco said, his voice low and suddenly hollow. He looked out through the rain-streaked glass at the distant harbor. They don't. We need their ports. Meanwhile, miles away from the panic of the boardroom, the atmosphere in the estate's private library remained perfectly composed. I sat in absolute silence. The house was empty of Marco's frantic energy, leaving me in the quiet space I had meticulously carved out for myself. Spread across the desk before me, rest inches from the discarded ring I had left behind days ago, were the digital copies of the rejected maritime contracts. I had quietly accessed them through the shared server before the security protocols locked down the network. I did not need an executive title to understand the architecture of a shipping empire. I only needed the numbers. I adjusted the reading lamp, illuminating the clinical, aggressive clauses Bianca had drafted. I traced my finger down the columns of tariff restructuring and port calculations. It took me less than 20 minutes to find the structural rot. Bianca had not only insulted Donato Vizzini's pride, she had completely miscalculated the logistical reality of the Sicilian docks. Reaching into the bottom drawer of the desk, I withdrew an object I kept wrapped in soft canvas. It was the leather-bound port ledger, a heavy, worn book that belonged to my late father. The pages were thick, yellowed with time, and filled with meticulous, handwritten records of Genoa shipping harbor routes, regional tariff exemptions, and tidal docking schedules. I opened the heavy book and laid it beside the printed correspondence. Bianca's modern team had demanded universal docking fees across all southern ports. They had failed to realize that the smaller harbors around Messina operated under century-old regional maritime laws granting seasonal tariff exemptions based on the olive and citrus harvest cycles. By demanding a flat corporate rate, Bianca was essentially demanding illegal taxation from Donato Vizzini's oldest allies. Furthermore, Bianca had scheduled the massive freighters to dock during the narrowest tidal windows of the month, a logistical impossibility that would have grounded the fleet. I did not smile. I did not feel a rush of triumphant vindication. Instead, a quiet, melancholic clarity washed over me. I turned another fragile page, my eyes scanning my father's elegant cursive Italian. For years, my husband and his sister had treated my heritage as a quaint, embarrassing relic. They had mistaken my soft accent for ignorance and my polite silence for a lack of intelligence. They did not understand that true power in the maritime world came from knowing the depth of the water, the history of the ports, and the language of the people who controlled the tides. Taking a blank sheet of heavy, cream-colored stationery, I began to cross-reference the flawed corporate drafts with the ancient regional laws. I translated Bianca's disastrous demands into their actual logistical outcomes. I wrote entirely in precise, dialect-heavy Italian, the very language Bianca had mocked at the Gala. The rain outside intensified, drumming a steady rhythm against the glass. I worked without rushing. The men in the glass towers had built an empire, but they had forgotten the foundation. When I finally set my silver fountain pen down, the solution was perfectly mapped out before me. The tariffs could be legally bypassed through historical exemptions, and the docking schedules could be corrected. But the solution required someone who understood the old world honor. I closed the old volume. I would not offer them this answer out of duty or obedience. If Marco wanted to save his empire, he would have to face the very woman his family had tried so desperately to keep invisible. Panic inside a glass house does not echo. It simply bounces off the cold, transparent walls until the air itself feels too heavy to breathe. From the shadows of the vaulted hallway, I watched the absolute unraveling of my husband's polished composure. The heavy mahogany double doors of Marco's private estate study had been left slightly ajar, casting a long, sharp blade of amber light across the imported Italian marble floor. Inside the room, the atmosphere was suffocating. Marco paced the length of the study. His tailored suit jacket had been discarded over a chair hours ago, and his silk tie hung loose, a rare, physical confession of his sudden loss of control. He held his phone to his ear, listening to yet another endless sequence of unanswered rings. Bianca sat rigidly on the sofa, nursing a crystal glass of scotch. Her usual arrogant posture had stiffened, her shoulders tight with an anxiety she absolutely refused to voice. Instead, she masked her mounting panic with the exact same classist condescension she routinely used on me. "They are being ridiculous," Bianca snapped, swirling the amber liquid. "They are ancient, stubborn relics, Marco. Old men obsessed with outdated honor codes and regional pride. We are a modern global logistics empire, not a 19th century village fish market. If Donato Vizzini wants to throw a tantrum over standard contract terminology, let him. We can easily find other partners." Marco stopped pacing. He turned to stare at his sister, his voice dropping into a tense, breathless register. "There are no other partners, Bianca. Do you truly not understand the architecture of this region? Donato controls the southern ports. Without his signature, the Sicilian transit routes remain entirely frozen. 3 of our largest commercial freighters are currently idling in international waters, bleeding capital by the hour because the harbor masters refuse to acknowledge our docking clearance. So we send Aldo back in," she countered, her voice tightening as the reality of their failure began to set in. "We offer a higher tariff margin. We give them a larger cut of the shipping fees. Money always works." "Not with them," Marco said, pressing the heels of his hands against his tired eyes. "They do not care about our corporate margins. They operate on respect, on dialect, on historical precedent. Aldo insulted them by treating their syndicate like a generic corporate subsidiary. You insulted them with those aggressive, legally threatening email drafts. They do not want our money right now. They want to watch us drown." He picked up the phone again, his fingers tapping the glass screen with a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm. He dialed another number. Another long, punishing silence filled the heavy air of the study. He was a man who possessed the immense wealth required to buy almost anything in the world, currently paralyzed by a locked door he did not know how to open. I stepped quietly back into the deep darkness of the corridor. I did not announce my presence. I did not walk into the brightly lit room to offer my assistance. Instead, I turned and made my way toward the sprawling, silent kitchen at the back of the estate. The house felt utterly cavernous tonight. I crossed the cold slate floor and moved toward the massive Calicut marble island. The kitchen was equipped with every high-end appliance imaginable. The industrial espresso machines Marco demanded for his early mornings, the automated ambient lighting, the temperature-controlled wine fridges. I ignored all of the luxury. I reached into a lower wooden cabinet and pulled out a simple cast-iron kettle. I carried it to the sink, the rush of cold water, the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the lower floor. I placed the kettle on the induction stove and slowly turned the dial. A week ago, my reaction to the scene in the study would have been entirely different. I would have felt the immediate, exhausting urge to fix his world. I would have brewed Marco's specific double espresso, arranged a small plate of biscotti, and carried it softly into the tense room. I would have gently asked to review the documents, using my native understanding of the regional nuances to explain exactly why the Sicilian patriarchs felt disrespected. I would have absorbed Bianca's inevitable sneers, quietly translating their corporate aggression into the poetic, honor-bound Italian the old maritime families required. I would have saved them both, and they would have accepted my invisible labor without ever acknowledging its true value. Tonight, I simply waited for the water to boil. The dry, papery rustle of chamomile flowers sounded incredibly loud in the empty kitchen as I spooned them into a ceramic mug. From down the hall, I could hear Marco's voice pitch higher, a sharp note of genuine desperation, finally bleeding through his rigid executive authority. Bianca's replies grew shorter, her defensive mockery wearing incredibly thin under the pressure. Their entire empire was built on ledgers, intimidation, and endless capital, but it was currently collapsing because they lacked the one thing they had spent years making fun of, a true, deep understanding of my heritage. Downstairs, resting securely on my desk in the private library, was my father's original handwritten notebook. The ancestral logbook contained the exact historical tariff precedents, the specific regional idioms of respect, and the deeply ingrained maritime codes that the traditionalist partners lived by. I knew exactly how to unlock the transit routes. The solution to their multi-million-dollar crisis was entirely within my grasp. The kettle began to hiss, a low, steady sound that anchored me to the present moment. I poured the steaming water over the chamomile, watching the soft golden color bloom outward in the cup. I wrapped my cold hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into my skin. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The tea was fragrant and calming. I leaned back against the cold glass counter, listening to the frantic unraveling of my husband's corporate world. For the first time in our entire marriage, I felt absolutely at peace. I would not save them tonight. I would let them exhaust every arrogant alternative they possessed. Only when they were completely out of options would I finally walk into that boardroom. Power rarely collapses in a sudden explosion. It suffocates quietly in a beautiful room. When the morning of the emergency summit arrived, late autumn light hung heavy over the New York harbor, filtering through the glass of the Moretti shipping boardroom. I stood in the shadow of the executive antechamber, separated from the impending collapse by a door left slightly ajar. Donato Vizzini arrived for the emergency summit with the deliberate gravity of a man who measured wealth in generations. Dressed in a tailored wool overcoat, the Sicilian patriarch carried the weight of the old world, despising the transactional efficiency of the younger Moretti generation. Marco stood at the head of the glass table, flanked by Bianca and Aldo Russo, their lead corporate negotiator. My husband offered his hand. Donato ignored it. He took his time unbuttoning his coat, allowing the heavy silence to stretch before offering a perfunctory nod. He did not look at Bianca at all. They took their seats. Aldo Russo immediately took the floor. The negotiator firmly believed corporate jargon could conquer any cultural divide. He projected charts onto the screen, speaking in rapid English about synergy, modernized tariffs, and streamlined logistics. Donato sat in stony silence, looking only at his own folded hands. Beside the patriarch sat a younger associate whose sole purpose was the weaponization of language. After every rapid point Aldo made, the associate translated it into Italian with agonizing slowness. He drew out every syllable, dragging the pace to a crawl. It was a masterful stonewall. They were dismantling Marco's team by refusing to engage on American terms, letting Moretti ambition bleed out in real time. I watched Marco adjust his silver cufflink, a habit displayed only when the floor dropped out from beneath him. Bianca sat rigidly, the cruel smirk from the gallery entirely absent. She tapped her gold pen against her notepad, the rhythmic clicking echoing in the gaps of the associates' deliberate pauses. The cultural gap formed a physical wall. Donato did not care about quarterly earnings. When they came packaged in the dismissive tone Bianca had used in her correspondence. If we look at the revised timeline, Aldo pushed harder. The younger associate raised a calm finger, cutting him off, and began another tortuously slow translation of a point made 3 minutes prior. In the antechamber, I looked down at my left hand, entirely bare since I had left my marital band on Marco's desk. I held the thick maritime record against my chest. I was watching my husband's empire suffocate, trapped by the ignorance his family wore as a badge of honor. Tailored suits could not buy a translation of dignity. People often mistake politeness for peace. They are not the same thing. For years, I had kept my voice soft and my presence small for a family that saw me as a decorative liability. But watching Marco stare blankly at the men dismantling his legacy, I knew that silence had run its course. I stepped forward and pushed the heavy oak door. It swung open silently, but the shift in air pressure drew every eye. The rhythmic clicking of Bianca's pen stopped. Wearing a simple charcoal dress, I carried only the history they had ignored. Marco froze, his hands gripping his leather chair as if bracing for impact. Bianca dropped her gold pen. It clattered violently in the stagnant room. "What is she doing in here?" she hissed. "Marco, get her out." I walked the length of the boardroom with measured steps, stopping directly across from Donato. I lowered the battered log onto the glass table. The soft thud of salt-stained leather meeting the modern surface echoed. I placed my hands lightly on the cover, my bare ring finger visible against the dark binding. Donato looked down at the faded crest. Very slowly, he raised his dark, assessing eyes to mine. I spoke. The words did not come out in the hesitant English Bianca had mocked at the charity gala. They arrived in elegant, formal Italian, grounded deeply in the melodic dialect of the Genoese shipping docks. "Don Vizzini," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the cold glass. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have noticed we are speaking two different languages. And I do not just mean English and Italian." The suffocating stillness fractured. The translating associate stopped mid-sentence. Donato's stony mask cracked, replaced by a slight widening of the eyes, followed immediately by something dangerous to my husband's team. Undivided attention. Bypassing the translator, I discarded Aldo's aggressive corporate terminology. I utilized the ancient idioms of the maritime trade, words not taught in Manhattan boardrooms. I addressed the honor of his family's routes in a dialect that proved I understood exactly who he was. The room held its breath. Marco stared as if a stranger had materialized in his wife's clothing. Bianca was entirely pale. The silence she had assumed meant ignorance was suddenly dominating the space. Donato leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass table. He completely turned his shoulder to Marco and the negotiator. He looked only at me. The glass walls of the Moretti shipping boardroom offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the New York harbor, but inside the atmosphere had grown suffocatingly small. I remained standing near the head of the glass table. I did not rush to sit. I did not look at my husband, nor did I acknowledge my sister-in-law, whose face had completely drained of its usual practiced arrogance. Instead, I kept my attention entirely on Donato Vizzini. The elderly Sicilian patriarch stared at me, his dark eyes narrowing beneath thick, lined brows. The dialect I had just spoken was not the sanitized, corporate Italian taught in elite Manhattan academies. It was the language of the docks, the salt-heavy vernacular of the Mediterranean coast, a rhythm that carried the generational weight of maritime trade. I began to speak again. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a quiet, unshakable architecture that commanded the silent room. I navigated the complex structure of regional maritime tariffs, moving seamlessly from the taxation laws of the Palermo Straits to the ancient, unspoken privileges granted to generational dockworkers in Genoa. Donato listened. The rigid line of his shoulders, tense and unyielding since he had arrived, began to slowly lower. To Marco, Bianca, and the aggressive corporate negotiator, Aldo. The exchange was a rapid, impenetrable wall of sound. They recognized the melody of the language, but the dense, technical maritime idioms were entirely beyond their comprehension. Bianca, who had spent hours at the charity gala mimicking my soft vowels, now sat perfectly still. She was trapped in the stark realization that she could not understand a single word being negotiated over her own family's empire. The sea does not recognize a contract written by men who have never tasted salt, I said to Donato in our native tongue. I maintained eye contact with the patriarch. It recognizes only those who understand the tide. Donato's expression shifted. A flicker of genuine warmth, rare and deeply guarded, appeared in the old man's eyes. He leaned forward, resting his clasped hands on the polished surface of the table. He responded in the same heavy, rhythmic dialect, testing my knowledge of the seasonal shipping routes and the specific exemptions required for high-value cargo passing through traditional ports. I answered him without hesitation. I spoke of the winter drafts, the vessel weight restrictions, and the specific regional harbor taxes that the modern corporate algorithms had failed to account for. My accent, the very thing I had been told to hide to avoid embarrassing the family, now filled the cold room with undeniable authority. I was no longer negotiating with an arrogant corporation. I was speaking with a daughter of the sea. As the tension in the room dissolved into mutual understanding, I finally lowered my gaze to the scattered documents on the table. I opened the leather-bound port ledger I had carried in with me. The thick, aged paper stood in stark contrast to the crisp, sterile printouts of Bianca's aggressive corporate drafts. I smoothed the page with my hand. It was a simple, deliberate gesture. Without breaking the rhythm of my elegant Italian, I guided Donato's attention to the specific logistical errors embedded in the proposed contracts. I traced the lines of faded ink, pointing out the miscalculated port tariff exemptions that had so deeply insulted the Sicilian partners. I showed him where the seasonal dockworker strikes had been entirely ignored and where the regional transit taxes had been wrongly assigned. I did not raise my head to look at Bianca. I did not use my fluency to hurl insults across the table, nor did I adopt the vindictive tone my sister-in-law had so freely deployed days ago. Cruelty was the weapon of the insecure. I possessed something far more devastating, absolute, unquestionable competence. It is a simple matter of administrative distance, I explained to Donato, my voice a calm, even current. When clerks draft agreements from a glass tower, they occasionally misunderstand the local customs of the harbor. An oversight of translation, nothing more. By framing the catastrophic errors as a mere administrative misunderstanding, I elegantly saved the patriarch's face while entirely dismantling Bianca's work. I provided a bridge over the insult, allowing the traditionalist partners to accept the revised terms without compromising their honor. Marco exhaled, eager to reclaim control of the room. We look forward to rectifying any previous logistical misunderstandings, he interrupted, attempting to project executive authority. We value this partnership deeply, and I am glad my wife was able to assist my team today in translating our true intentions. He extended his hand across the table, expecting the traditional clasp of finalized business. The older man did not take it. He did not even look at him. Instead, the patriarch slowly turned his broad shoulders, shifting his physical presence away from the air and directing his attention solely toward me. The gesture was deliberate, a total erasure of Marco's standing in the room. When Donato spoke, his voice was a low rumble of pure respect. He spoke exclusively in the melodic, maritime dialect of our shared coastline, refusing to offer a single syllable of English. The sea does not suffer fools, and neither do I, Donato said softly, his dark, intelligent eyes locking onto mine. Your husband builds glass towers, he reads spreadsheets. But you, figlia mia, you know the weight of the water, you know the exact salt in the wood. You possess the mind of a true merchant, and the absolute honor of the old world. He withdrew a heavy, vintage fountain pen from his tailored wool suit, a personal artifact, miles apart from the corporate plastic scattered across the boardroom. He uncapped it slowly, the gold metal gleaming in the cold afternoon light, but he did not sign the paper. Instead, Donato slid the contract and the open pen across the polished wood, the items coming to a halt exactly in front of my hands. I will not bind my ships to a man who does not know his own ports, the patriarch declared, his tone final and uncompromising. I sign this only if the daughter of Genoa signs it first. You will be the lead coordinator of this route. He pointed a thick finger at the paper, bypassing Marco entirely. If your signature is not on the primary line, my ships do not leave the harbor. Marco exhaled a sharp, jagged breath, the sound of a man realizing he had just been publicly demoted in his own fortress. Aldo Russo shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his aggressive negotiation tactics rendered entirely useless by a single demand of traditional honor. I looked down at the document, focusing on the specific line where Marco's name had been printed in bold, arrogant letters. Without a single word of hesitation, without offering a glance of permission toward the man I had married, I picked up the heavy fountain pen. The ink flowed dark and perfectly smooth as I signed my own name, calmly claiming the power that had always been mine to take. Donato nodded, a slow, deep gesture of profound approval, before taking the pen back and adding his own sweeping signature directly beside mine. The heavy oak doors eventually opened, and Donato's entourage quietly filed out, leaving behind a profound, echoing silence in the glass-walled sanctuary. The crisis had been averted, the empire was saved. Yet, the atmosphere inside the room felt less like a victory and more like the immediate aftermath of a storm. I did not celebrate. I simply aligned the edges of the leather-bound port ledger and placed my hands back into my lap. Anger was loud. Triumph was loud. Calm meant that a fundamental truth had already been established, requiring no further defense. Across the wide expanse of glass, Bianca remained seated. The sister-in-law who had spent 3 hours at a charity gala performing a theatrical parody of my English pronunciation was now entirely robbed of her voice. She did not look at me. She did not look at her brother. She simply stared down at the smooth surface of the table, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she reached out to gather her erroneous drafts. The contrast was absolute. Her designer cashmere and carefully cultivated aura of high society superiority had been stripped of all leverage. She had walked into this room believing that status and aggressive corporate posturing were enough to command respect. Instead, she had been forced to sit in suffocating silence while the woman she dismissed as a foreign embarrassment effortlessly salvaged the legacy she had nearly destroyed. She slid her papers into a sleek leather portfolio, the usually confident rhythm of her movements replaced by a slow, protective hesitation. There was no argument she could offer, no sarcastic defense she could mount. The reality of my logistical expertise and the respect it commanded from the most unyielding patriarch in their industry had dismantled her worldview in less than 20 minutes. People often mistake arrogance for competence. They are not the same thing, and the distinction becomes painfully visible the moment real substance is required. Bianca finally stood up, the legs of her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She kept her eyes cast down, her chin tucked defensively against her collar, actively avoiding any possibility of eye contact. Her expensive heels, which normally clicked across marble floors with the sharp, demanding cadence of a woman who owned the world, now moved with a quiet, defeated shuffle toward the exit. She paused briefly near the threshold, her hand lingering on the heavy brass handle of the door. For a fraction of a second, I thought she might turn around. I thought she might finally acknowledge the immense, invisible labor I had always provided, or at least offer a fragile apology for the cruelty she had worn like a badge of honor. Instead, she simply pushed the door open and disappeared into the hallway, swallowed by the cold, vast architecture of the building. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive pleasure watching her retreat. I only felt the quiet, steadying clarity of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. I remained in my chair, the crisp, signed contract sitting between Marco and me, the ink completely dry, the balance of our marriage permanently and irrevocably changed. That evening, the penthouse was entirely silent when we crossed the threshold. The ambient hum of the city remained trapped behind triple-glazed floor-to-ceiling windows, leaving the expansive foyer feeling like an empty museum after hours. Marco trailed behind me, his footsteps heavy and uneven against the imported marble. He had shed his suit jacket somewhere in the hallway, the armor of his corporate authority completely dissolved by the afternoon's revelations. I walked straight into the master suite, the room where I had left my ring days ago. I placed my father's leather-bound port ledger on the edge of the massive mahogany desk. Next to it sat the platinum wedding band, It caught the dim light of the street lamps filtering through the glass, a tiny, perfect circle of metal that had once represented a silent promise of mutual protection. Marco noticed it immediately. He stopped near the doorway, his chest rising and falling in a fractured rhythm. The man who dictated terms to global shipping conglomerates suddenly did not know what to do with his hands. He stepped forward, his movements overly cautious, as if approaching a stranger in his own home. His fingers brushed the cool surface of the desk before closing gently over the ring. He murmured my name, the syllables feeling unfamiliar in his mouth, stripped of their usual distracted haste. He lifted the band, holding it out toward me like a fragile peace offering, his dark eyes searching my face for the automatic forgiveness he had always relied upon. He spoke softly, telling me I had saved their legacy, asking to put the ring back where it belonged. He reached for my left hand. His touch was warm, desperate, and entirely unearned. I did not pull away violently. I simply turned my palm downward, a small, quiet shifting of angles that halted his movement completely. The air in the study grew incredibly still. I reached out with my right hand, taking the piece of cold metal from his fingertips. The metal was already warming from his skin, but it still felt impossibly heavy. I opened the top drawer of the mahogany desk. The hinges made a soft, metallic sound in the quiet room. I placed the platinum wedding band inside, resting it delicately beside a stack of blank stationery, and pushed the drawer shut with a definitive click. I looked at him, my voice barely louder than the hum of the climate control. I told him that apologies are merely spoken, but respect must be built. I watched his jaw tighten, the reality of the closed drawer settling into the space between us. He wanted a grand reconciliation, an immediate erasure of the humiliation I had endured while he stood by and laughed at his sister's cruel jokes. But immediate forgiveness was just another form of erasure. I smoothed the lapel of my simple coat, informing him that if this partnership were to continue in any capacity, it would no longer exist in the margins of his life. He did not argue. He simply stood there, absorbing the undeniable boundary, finally understanding that the woman I was had always been the only foundation holding his empire together. I left him standing in the shadows of the study and walked toward the glass doors leading out to the terrace. The heavy handle turned with a solid, reassuring thud. As the seal broke, the sterile air of the penthouse was instantly replaced by the sharp, biting wind of the Atlantic. I stepped out onto the cold stone tiles, letting the heavy door slide shut behind me, sealing the silence of the apartment away. The raw noise of the city rushed in, a chaotic symphony of distant sirens, groaning steel, and the low, resonant horns of the cargo ships navigating the dark waters of the harbor below. I walked to the edge of the thick glass railing and rested my hands on the freezing metal frame. The damp, salty air clung to my skin, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of the ocean and diesel fuel. It was a harsh, unrefined smell, nothing like the curated floral perfumes that had suffocated the gallery Gala earlier that week. But it was profoundly real. It was the scent of the Genoese docks where I had learned the trade. It was the scent of my father's ink-stained fingers tracing routes on old maps. It was the scent of the complex logistical world I had quietly mastered while wearing a designer dress and maintaining a polite, agreeable smile. Far below, massive freighters moved through the black water like slow, deliberate leviathans. Each one carried thousands of tons of cargo, navigating unseen currents with quiet, undeniable precision. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling my lungs expand until the cold air ached pleasantly in my chest. For years, I had shrunk myself to fit into a beautiful, fragile frame, carefully modulating my syllables and hiding my intelligence to avoid bruising fragile egos. I had believed that shrinking was the price of belonging, but belonging that required my reduction was simply a gilded cage. Marco would try to change. He would cancel meetings and attempt to learn the intricate details of the life I had built outside his view. Whether his efforts would ever be enough to reopen that mahogany drawer remained a question I felt no urgency to answer. The future was no longer tied to his approval. I watched a distant buoy blinking red against the dark expanse of the water, a steady, reliable rhythm in the chaos. Marriages are not saved by extraordinary boardroom victories. They are rebuilt, if they are rebuilt at all, through ordinary, difficult choices made every single day. The harbor wind caught the loose strands of my hair, pulling them across my face, and for the first time since arriving in this glass castle, The horizon did not feel like a boundary. It felt like an open road.